I can do that. And this is also there in several of my writings. This is there in a 1998 article that I wrote in EPW. Okay, 1984 is a watershed, both for occupational health and safety as well as environment in India. Because the gas accident, gas tragedy happened. As you know, uh, the government, of course, admitted that about 2,800 people died. But journalist friends basically, they felt that something like 7 to 8,000 died. But government today does agree that about 25,000 people died in that tragedy because a lot of people died subsequently. We had a flurry of enactments that came. The Factories Act was changed, and additional what are called TLVs. These are shop floor standards were brought in into this Factories Act. And then you had an entirely new Environmental Protection Act, which came in 1986. And along with it, you had several critical rules that were framed at that time. What is called the hazardous chemicals rules and the hazardous waste rules. These were all framed between 1986 and 1987. Now, EIAs began to be done late 1986, 87. And, a lot of environmentalists and persons from the uh, legal kind of background, they get it wrong. They think that EIA started in 1994 after the first notification was gazetted. That's not correct. Because I almost finished doing EIAs in 1995, 96. Because it's around that time that the whole EIA process started getting corrupt. And I gave up doing EIAs for companies in 1996. So, yeah, so basically they started around 1986, 1987. And the first notification happened, EIA notification, it was a simple notification. It was notified in 1994. This was then further amended in 2006. And there was let's say the 2006 and the 1994, the difference between them is there was some tightening of procedures in the 2006 notification, some loosening of what industries should be doing and things of the sort. So there was already a loosening that happened. Now, as you go on, the relaxation started happening by what are called government orders. There were several government orders that happened after 2006, and that continued. I think something like 50 government orders came out, by which time I had given up and I had moved on, from doing impact assessments and such things. And I found it more productive to work with the UN, uh, which is what I started doing. Okay. Now, impact assessment is supposed to be a science, but actually nobody really does impact assessment in this country. What is you are supposed to look at something like about uh, 8 or 10, sometimes up to 12 different disciplines. Um, you have, obviously, you have to look at air, you have to look at water, you have to look at soil conditions, which also means that you look at the uh, geomorphology of an area. And then you look at the forests, you look at, things of that sort. Okay, and then you look at in the forest, you look at if there is any wildlife, what kind of wildlife there is. Okay, now let me, I wish I had I even got some slides ready to show you because see, all of environmental science and environmental engineering is an interplay between three things. You have a source, and that source emits a pollutant, or there is a hazard. Okay, now there is a pathway, and the pathway is not necessarily, usually it is a straightforward pathway. It's either by through the air or it's through the water. But sometimes it can be a complex pathway. Like I'll give you an example. Uh, Suddenly in Singrauli, which at that time, now it's of course a much higher capacity, it had 12,000 megawatts of coal-based power capacity. And suddenly, the people who were doing the EIA found mercury in cattle milk at levels which were unacceptable. How did it go there? Now, it went through a bit of a complex pathway. We all know that coal, for example, has several heavy metals, and mercury is one of them. And so coal has mercury, and when you burn coal in a thermal power plant, you let out ash. A lot of it is caught, but some of it does go out. And that then settles on the grass, and cattle eat the grass. And then what happens is heavy metals bioaccumulate in the cattle body, in the cows and the buffaloes. That gets into the milk, and that's how it then humans, ingest it. So this is a bit of a complex pathway. Okay. So the third is a receptor. So you have a source for a pollutant. You have a pathway in the middle, and pathways normally are simple pathways like air or water or soil or something of that sort, but sometimes they can be complex. And then you have basically a receptor. Now, what are the 5 or 6 receptors that we normally look at in an area? So the first is always humans are a receptor. Okay. The second receptor are, for example, a water body. Okay. Because if you dump acid gases into a water body, then that water body will acidify, and in due course, the acidification can in fact kill a water body completely. And this happened in Sweden over a period of 10 years. And they were totally puzzled as to why and Sweden has 16,000 lakes. Yeah. Now, the Swedes were totally puzzled as to why the pH of the lakes went down. You understand what is pH, right? Yeah. Okay, good. So the pH went down because they knew that their emissions were not that high. And then it took them 10 years to trace it back to Germany and Britain. And mind you, so you have what is called long range transport of these acid gases. Sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide both are acid gases. And they travel over 500 kilometers, 800 kilometers, even they can travel even up to 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers, in fact. So, uh, water is the second thing, obviously, that we look at. The third thing that we look at is forests, if there are any forests close by. Okay. And then the fourth thing is we look at crops, because crops tend to be, vegetation tends to be sensitive to air pollution. And then the last of the major receptors that we look at are buildings, because buildings construction, particularly if there are old structures like mosques or temples. I had some beautiful pictures of where, in a temple, beautiful carvings of women warriors in a South Indian temple have got erased because of acid gases. Eroded, not erased. Okay. So you look at structures, but there can be other receptors in different places which can be quite sensitive. For example, if you have things like salt pans, and there's a thermal power plant next to a salt pan, then it is going to continuously deposit uh, heavy metals into the salt. And this is there particularly in coastal area, around coastal area power plants. And I have pictures of such things. And normally the guys who do the EIA never look at these particular aspects. Or if you have things like aqua farms are particularly sensitive to changes in air quality or the pH of the water and things of this sort. So you have these three things. That's what all environmental science and all environmental engineering really looks at. These three. It's an interplay of these three issues. Okay, so what does basically the law look at? The law tells the emitter that this is how much you can emit. And the law basically says that essentially the quality of air and the quality of water should be XYZ. So under the Air Act and the Water Act was, I think, 1974, and the Air Act came in 1981, and the EPA Act came in 1986. Now, correct me if my figures on the Air and Water Act are wrong, but I do know that the Water Act goes back to the 70s and the Air Act is early 80s, 81, I think. Okay. Under the Air and Water Act, basically, there are what are called ambient quality standards. That means the air and water should have this quality. Okay. And the quality is sometimes differentiated by saying the quality in industrial areas should be this, particularly for air, and the quality in residential areas should be this, and the quality in sensitive areas should be XYZ, whatever that be. Okay. The, so you have ambient quality standards for air and water, and you have what are called emission standards for projects which release air pollutants or water pollutants. Okay. Now I won't go into things like the Hazardous Chemicals Act and things of that sort, because some of that is not adequate in our country in any case. Okay. Having said this, now environmental impact assessment started, like I said, being done around 86, 87. And in fact, I started doing it in 88 with a company in Delhi, where I actually joined them to do work in safety because they had nobody in safety. But work in safety hadn't started. So I picked up environmental, I started doing EIAs and got initially did a lot more environmental engineering than I did, safety engineering. Of course, later on, safety engineering also picked up. Fine. Okay. Now, in India, what happens is that impact assessment, a lot of it, basically really is collecting, the way it is done, is collecting background based data on all these things that I talked about: air, water, noise, forests, on crops. Then you have, again, on things like vegetation. You have, for example, what kind of fauna do you have in that area? What kind of soils do you have? And there is a general chapter on socioeconomics, which most of the guys, not most, in fact, all of them hashed it up because they don't know anything about socioeconomics. Okay. Particularly, they don't know any of the quantitative techniques that have to be used in socioeconomics. So you have that. And then you have the next thing, trying to predict the impact if the release of pollutants is so much, then what will be the impact? Actually, the entire impact chapter is very shoddy in India, because all that is done is they do what is called air quality modeling, and that too they use US EPA models which have not been validated in India. And this is my constant complaint. In fact, CPCB tried to validate them, and scientists who worked under me at one time, in fact, were given the job of validating, and they didn't validate in India. Now, the reason for their not validating is because our atmospheric conditions are somewhat different from that in the US. Particularly, what there is something called atmospheric chemistry. That is, if I release some sulfur dioxide and my soils are alkaline, as happens to be in, for example, in northern India, the entire northern Indian, the Gangetic Valley is full of alkaline soils. And so these alkaline soils, when they get entrained into the atmosphere, they neutralize part of the sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. So your model result never actually agrees with the actual monitored data. So they use the models as they are, and they collect only one season data as to whether whether that data is even correct. Nobody checks, and then it goes on. Now there are models to do even things like water quality predictions and so on, but I have hardly ever seen anybody in this country really do. I did some of it when I actively did EIAs, but I've hardly seen anybody else really do this kind of work. There is, of course, even things like you can do modeling even for soil, though it's more complex. If you put a hazardous substance into the soil, then to what extent will it seep into the groundwater and things of this sort? It can be modeled, and there are models for it. More complex, and of course, it means more expense, because then you have to dig out the soil in different strata and then you have to do various tests as to what is its porosity and things like that. So literally, the impact chapter in most of the EIAs, and I've seen hundreds of them, really does only air quality modeling, and that too wrongly. And basically, you know, they say everything else is hunky dory, everything is fine. And then they write the last chapter, which is called Environmental Management Plan. Virtually all environmental management plans basically say, oh, you do a little bit of this, that, and the other, and everything will be okay. Now, my question is very simple. We've been doing EIAs now for what, 35 years? Almost mid 80s to 2020. It's 35 years. How come the environment has deteriorated so badly? And I've asked this question. Of course, now I don't even interact very much with uh, um, the Ministry of Environment or CPCB. CPCB has become a fairly rundown organization now. Most of the good people have left. I know you're recording. I don't mind, because I don't mind saying this quite publicly. I've known many of the stalwarts in CPCB. Dr. G.V. Agarwal, in fact, who was the first member secretary, uh, for which about 200 people gathered. I think almost 200 people gathered yesterday on a Zoom meeting to pay tribute to him. He was one of the stalwarts, and he was my mentor, in fact. So, all those stalwarts have left CPCB quite some time back. So CPCB really has nobody worth the salt today. That's the general understanding in the environmental engineering world also today. So I really don't have much faith that our regulators are in fact in a position to do very much. Okay, having said that, now coming back to EIAs itself, let me stick to EIAs as such. What did happen was there was a certain amount of relaxation through what are called government orders between 2006 and 2020. And in 2020, you suddenly find that there is a lot more relaxation that is proposed, which is that a lot of projects will not be covered. You have post facto environmental clearances happening. You have compliance as it is. Compliance is pretty shoddy in this country. And compliance now, industry is supposed to submit instead of once in 6 months, once in a year. So there's a whole lot of relaxation. Okay. Now, essentially, if you look at this whole process, public hearings, in fact, the other day somebody was saying, somebody no less than a former chairman of the Central Pollution Control Board, in fact, once told me long ago that public hearing does not mean public listening. And now from public listening, it's going to become public whispering. And actually, it's a police hearing. This is what, basically somebody said. The whole thing is people are herded. Those who really want to speak are hardly given 1 minute. Many people are shut up, and people are even arrested today. This is the whole situation that you have on board. On the other hand, what has happened? I did a computation. And this is quite easy, not very difficult to do at all, at least for air, pollutants. Because air pollutants are directly proportional to the amount of fossil fuels you burn. Now, between 1994 and to 2020, the quantum of air pollutants has actually increased about 3 times. And for certain spheres, I have computed even liquid effluents, it's gone up between 4 to 5 times. Okay. How come in a country which has a population density of 400 and something, 20 or whatever it is, where the pollution load has gone up 3 times, minimum 3 times, that we are relaxing? What does it really imply? Okay. And COVID is used as the excuse. What actually this entire EIA relaxation, 2020 draft notification, I believe has been in the making for the last 1 year. That's what I've been told. Okay. So basically what it means is that essentially industry or business is going to be allowed to make more money. and COVID is being used as an excuse that, oh, they've gone into losses, so let them make profits. Whereas you put more risk on both people and other receptors and their livelihoods, because a lot of people get their livelihood out of things like yields. And studies that we have done around, for example, power plants, including in Maharashtra, have indicated that you have anything like about an average of 15% up to 25 kilometers from a power plant, you have a 15% crop yield loss because of the acid gases. Mind you, it's not the acid gases alone that impact. There is a secondary pollutant called ozone that is developed. And till some time back, we didn't even have ozone standards in this country. Okay. Now, having said this, basically the whole exercise is meant to allow businesses to make more profit, while ordinary bystander people will have to spend more money. That's what it is. It's a transfer of income and wealth. This is what is really the whole thing. Now, I have been on state government committees for about 3.5 years or so, and I have been on central government committees besides on Supreme Court committees twice. And I've had the opportunity to get an insider view on how this whole thing operates. Now, essentially, in 2007, I was appointed to be on a Government of India committee to suggest improvements to the EIA process and EIA, how EIAs are done, as well as how environmental clearances are given. Now, let me talk a little bit about environmental clearances. Environmental clearances in this country happen at two levels. It's a two-stage thing. See, under the Air and Water Act, you have to get what is called a consent for establishment. Before the project can be launched, you have to get a consent for the establishment from the State Pollution Control Board. You don't have, the Central Pollution Control Board has nothing to do with granting consents. You have to get it either from the State Pollution Control Board, or if you're a union territory, from what is called, for example, in Delhi, you have something called the Delhi Pollution Control Committee. So you have to get it from the Union Territory Pollution Control Committee. Okay. Now, before you start the plant, or at periodic intervals after you start the plant, you have to go back and get a consent for operations. So a consent basically relies on the air and water quality standards that have been set up under the Air and Water Act. Okay. There are standards that have been actually set up. Okay. So, and this is by law. I mean, there are acts to do this. Whereas the impact assessment is by a government order. It's by notification in a gazette. Right? So it's a lower level of a legal device as compared to the consent document. There is no way you can. So basically, if you want to change the standards, then you have to change the rules itself under the Air or the Water Act. Whereas if you want to change the EIA procedure, then it can be done by a government order.
Sorry,
by notification, like,
I'm interrupting here. I'm still recording. Should I stop recording since we're now moving into another segment of the conversation?
No, you can continue recording. I will tell you when to stop. Because I'm laying down the ground, for what is the legal structure. So this is fine, right? Okay. So what happens is that the environmental governance in India basically has been written somewhat in line with the Indian Penal Code. At least that's my reading. That is, if you are not a violator, or if you have not been caught violating the law, you can continue doing business as usual. But if you're caught, then you will be fined or jailed or both. Now, this is how the IPC operates, as I understand the IPC. I'm not a lawyer, but the little bit I know, having rubbed shoulders with lawyers or whatever it is, this is how it works. It follows what Lord Macaulay wrote, I think, way back in 1860 or something of that sort, when he framed the IPC, right? Now, At the ground level, the way that environmental management happens for example, in an enterprise doesn't happen this way at all. It happens very differently. It doesn't follow the law because it wants to follow the law. It follows the law because it has to follow the law. And then, the enterprise decides whether it wants to follow the law or wants to bypass the law. And bypassing the law is pretty easy in this country, particularly if there's no evidence. And that is the whole problem with the environment, that the evidence can be hidden or can disappear altogether. So you can, on paper, you can comply with the law, and actually you don't. I'll tell you how it happens. And this is actually something that practitioners know. This is not lawyers, and for example, people who there are a lot of NGOs that are dealing with EIs and things of the sort. They don't have the ground experience to understand how the law is violated. I'll tell you how it is done. Okay? Which is why you have to look at this whole problem somewhat differently from the way that lawyers and the NGOs are looking at this whole problem. Okay. Now, how does an enterprise really operate? It operates very simply. If I have money, if I'm making profits, then I will follow the law. To the extent that the law says that I have to do this, that, and the other, I will do. If I don't have enough of a bottom line, then I will do some today, some tomorrow. And if I don't have a bottom line at all, I want to put all the money into the pocket of either the private guy or whatever it is. I say, to hell with it. I won't follow the law. If and when somebody catches me and I have to pay a fine, I'll pay a fine. That's it. That's the way it actually operates on the ground. And mind you, this is not unique to India at all. This, to that extent, happens everywhere. I mean, I've been around in Europe, I've been around in Northern America. To a lesser extent, it happens even there. And there have been major cases on all these issues. If you've seen the movie Erin Brockovich, which is a true life story, this is exactly what happened out there. Okay. Now, if you divide countries, the countries also divide in the same fashion. There are some countries which, by and large, say, okay, we'll get them to follow the law. They have a strong regulating authority. Some countries say, okay, we'll do some today, some tomorrow, and some countries say, to hell with it, we don't have money. When I saw Nepal for the first time, say, in the 80s, Nepal, followed that kind of a thing. We don't understand environment. Why should we bother about it? We don't have much of a load. But today, they've got into a regime where they're doing a little bit here. They're trying to control emissions from brick kilns and things of this sort. So it's a question of, I've seen plants in India which are as good as plants I've seen in the US. As good. And I've seen plants there which are as bad as the worst plants that you can find here. Okay? It's a question of what is the percentage in category 1, category 2, and category 3. Okay? We have a smaller percentage in category 1. They have a much larger percentage in category 1. This is where the problem is. So essentially, the way that environmental management is done at the enterprise level follows the laws of economics. And very simply, I will give you an example from your own city. Even when I was in that city, you had these insurers sitting outside stations who would say, don't buy a monthly pass on the suburban system. You pay us half the amount or something of that sort. If and when you get caught, just get us the receipt, we'll refund you the entire amount. That guy makes money and you make money. You save money and that fellow makes money also. Now, who suffers? The railways. This is what has happened, actually. So the guy who really doesn't follow the law, he says, if and when I'm caught, I will pay up if I have to, both below the table and above the table. It's less expensive. Simple laws of economics. See, the whole problem is that the law, as it is structured today, presumes that you're actually going to follow it. In practice, it is not followed. Now, how do I hide? How do I hide evidence? Supposing I say that air quality. Now, wind, as you know, will keep shifting every 2 hours, right? So there are what are called peak ground level concentrations, and they will happen in certain directions, and they will vary from the time of the day. For example, peak ground level concentration of pollutants will be closer to the source midday, and there'll be much. And as the day lengthens, as it becomes cooler, the peak ground level concentration goes further away from the plant. You have to do modeling to find out where, and you have to know the windrows where to place your, air monitoring station, right? Now, supposing in my consent letter to an industry, I say, please uh, monitor air at 3 locations around your plant. The consent letter doesn't tell them where. Now, supposing I even say that you put an automatic station, okay? All I have to do is put the station 300 meters in some other direction, in an off-wind direction. And even if I'm a violator, that is my, I don't meet the what are called ambient air quality standards, my monitoring station is saying that you're meeting the air quality standards because it's not picking up the peaks. This is how it's done. Now, if I have an effluent treatment plant, for example, all I have to do is the effluent treatment plant will always have a discharge point. You'll have an outfall. The outfall invariably for a large plant is usually into some stream or a river, right? All I have to do is dig a kacha ditch and then let it out half a kilometer downstream from the outfall, and no regulator, I mean, nobody from the pollution control board, no pollution control board officer is going to wade through waist deep muck. It's muck there, in a river on the bank, and try to locate, for example, if there is a kacha, sort of a drain that has been actually made in order to let untreated effluent into the stream or river. You can't catch these things. Who is it who can really catch? It's the local people who can catch. So basically, in 2007, I think I'm going on for too long on this before I really come to the strategy. But you need to probably understand some of these things as to why we are saying certain things. And these are things you will not get from most of the other guys who are talking about EIAs. They're all very well-intentioned, good people. But they haven't done this kind of work. They haven't seen, they haven't done EIAs. And it's only when you work with plants do you really understand. It's like working with a patient. The doctors who work in general hospitals, government general hospitals, particularly in their formative years, learn hell of a lot because they see such a wide variety of patients. They don't see such a wide variety of patients in corporate hospitals. Okay, so that's the way. I mean, when you work with industry, that is when you actually see things and how it works, how it operates. Right. So let me come to, in 2007, I was on a government committee. I was Government of India committee, whose mandate was basically to reform the EIA methodology and the environmental clearance process. This came just after the 2006 EIA notification, right? So what happened is that the first chairman of that committee, Dr. Dilip Biswas, who had just retired as the chairman of the Central Pollution Control Board, saw the composition of the committee and said he didn't want to chair. That he would want to be, that what he meant was, listen, I'm going to have a difficult time chairing this group, so I'll just be an ordinary member. So there was no chairperson for that. Then Mr. Rajamani was drafted in to be the chairman of that committee. And after the first meeting where we decided that this is too important a subject to try and do it in the, within the 4 walls of a room sitting in Delhi somewhere in the Planning Commission. Planning Commission was the host, organization for this entire process. So we said, let's hold public hearings in many places in India. Let's hear what public has to say as to how EIAs and the environmental clearance processes should be reformed and improved. The Planning Commission didn't facilitate this. They can't say no to an autonomous committee because the committee's terms of reference were already given. And you'll find these terms of reference in that long letter which I wrote in Annex 5, I think. And then what happened is because they didn't facilitate Mr. Rajmani and Mr. Rajmani was the former secretary of the Ministry of Environment in 1994, 95, I think. Yeah. So it was when he was the secretary that the first and probably the best EIA notification was gazetted. Okay. Um, Now, Rajmani and I resigned from that committee and we wrote our own memorandum, which is in Annex 5. Now, cut a long story short, we said 5 or 6, important things there. One is we said there is no definition for what is acceptable and unacceptable impact, and this is the bane of EIAs and the environmental clearance processes today. This is the biggest bane, that you don't have a standard, unlike air or water. So, what do you really measure as to what is acceptable and what is unacceptable? So, my contention is that the entire dam process is completely subjective and arbitrary. So at one time you say this area is ecologically sensitive, there should be no plant there. 10 years later, you say, oh, it's all right, you can put a plant. The whole damn thing is arbitrary. And I've given one example there, I can give you 5 more examples of things that I have personally worked on, where the whole thing is arbitrary. Okay. So there is no standard. So we said, all right, the way to define whether impact is acceptable or unacceptable is to set up 5 standards, 4 or 5 standards, as I remember. It's all there in Annex 5, okay, in that letter. Then the second thing we said is that it is the impacted party that should do the EIA, that is the bystander population. And if it's a brownfield plant, that should include the workers of the plant. They should do the EIA, give, levy a standard kind of for different sizes of plants and types of plants. Let there be a standard fee that is collected from them, and they give the money to the local body, which then, if it wants, it can do it itself, or if it wants to hire consultants, then it hires consultants. Okay. And it's the impacted party that should do the impact assessment, not the impacting party. It's like, basically what is being done today. It's, I'm sure all of you understand Hindi. It's like ulta chor date kotwal. This is what is happening. So at the end of each EIA, which is a shoddy job, often plagiarized and copy pasted from several places, basically you're saying, I'm okay, you're okay, do these 2 or 3 minor things and everything will be okay. My question is, how come the environment has got spoiled after 35 years of environmental clearance process? And there is no answer. And I've asked this sometimes in seminars way back in the past, even of chairmen of different pollution control boards, and they don't have an answer to this question. They just don't have an answer. They can't answer this question. And I'm not talking of just urban environments. I'm talking about rural environments. How come it has got spoiled? No answer. So what does it tell us? That the environmental governance process, because the EIA and the environmental clearance is the primary, what you can call it, license to pollute. And how much can you pollute? How can you pollute? How do you restrict? It's a license to pollute, basically. Okay. Just like a driver's license. This is a license. Right? Okay. The third thing we said is shut down the pollution control boards. Now, why did we say this? We said this. I know it's being recorded. It's all right. I have no problem. We said this because the pollution control board started becoming corrupt around the mid-90s or a little after that. Okay. And basically, you bribe one fellow, you get your job done. Okay. Now, if you hand over the consent for operations and consent for establishment to the local self-governments like panchayats and municipalities, you have to bribe 10 fellows, not one guy. And in a village, it's more difficult to bribe because everyone's eye is on, what the punch is doing. So that is one, and your own family, is a victim, right? Then what did we say? We said that, okay, you maintain the dual clearance process, particularly for larger plants, for the red category plants. We said that, fine. So you shift it from the state level, that is State Pollution Control Board, to the local level. giving consent for establishment and consent for operations. But the environmental clearance continues to remain with the union government. What we said is that the body that gives the environmental clearance, shift it out of the Ministry of Environment, make it autonomous, and give it the same powers as the Election Commission, which is a body that has worked pretty well in India, by and large. Okay? And we said a few other things which you can read up out there. These are some of the main things we said. Okay? None of this got implemented. We were hoping that some of the people's organizations would take it up. They didn't take it up, whatever their reasons be. One or two did. Now, having said this, we come to the current juncture. Okay? That we have a draft notification which is basically going to relax environmental governance in this country, allow businesses to make more profit, put more risk on people. And we have an environmental clearance process which is pretty shoddy ab initio. Maybe it was a little better earlier. But here in 2017, you have a violations committee which is giving post facto, clearance, environmental clearance certifications. Like the LG Polymers accident that happened. Those guys didn't have an environmental clearance at all, even though it's an early 60s plant. The plant was set up in the 60s, early 60s. Now, they had a consent from the State Pollution Control Board, but they didn't have an environmental clearance at all. So you have a whole series of measures out there which are basically saying, okay, you guys, we are going to allow you to do more chori of the environment. Whereas the sufferers are going to be the local people. Something has to be done.